Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for tonight's clinical seminar. This is part 2 of our series on the limbic system, fight, flight, freeze. Part 2, the limbic system, behavior dysregulation, and de-escalation. Last month, we took a deep dive into the structures of the limbic system. Tonight, we're going to review some of those and move on to talking about how we use this knowledge to create effective de-escalation strategies that target the cause of the problem, which is the limbic system, rather than viewing it as willful behaviors. For those of you who are new to CMHRC, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Errico, and I am the Executive Director of the Children's Mental Health Resource Center. Our mission is to provide guidance and resources for early identification and management of mood disorders, bipolar disorder, and its newly identified phenotype called fear of harm. We provide these resources and guidance for families as well as mental and physical healthcare practitioners, teachers, and educators. We have a number of programs and services that provide this guidance and resources. That includes our diagnostic consultation program, where we work with families as well as with providers to help clarify likely diagnoses, understand what the best practices are in terms of treatment, and to share the latest research into treatment for these disorders with families as well as with providers. And we have a school advocacy program where we speak with schools on behalf of families, attend IEP and 504 plan meetings so that we can advocate for children for the mental health needs that they have when they're at school and in the classroom. We have a community advocacy program that helps families manage their community interactions with children who have mental health challenges. And we have our CMHRC toolkit, which I have to say we're all very proud of. It is a web app that helps track symptom presentation and severity, medication history and compliance, mood tracking, and it even has a way to track the daily weather as well as hours of sunlight. And if you have a mood disorder or the fear of harm phenotype of bipolar, you know how important weather and sunlight can be towards symptom manifestation. We also have membership programs for providers and practitioners, which allow access to all kinds of additional resources and guidance from our staff. We also have a provider transition program. Sometimes it may be time to change providers. Your child may age out of a program. You may move to a new part of the country, and it helps to have professionals who can help you figure out how to communicate with a new provider and what information needs to be carried over from your previous provider to the new one. As I mentioned, we are a national nonprofit 501c3 charity organization, and that means that the bulk of our programming stems from the generosity of our donors. So it is the year end. We know everyone is asking for gifts at the year end, but we too are having a fundraiser that is running through the end of the year. From every donation, from a major grant or major donor to the $10 that was donated by a grateful 12-year-old and his younger sister, every single gift is important to us and helps us to fulfill our mission and bring hope to families and children everywhere. So if you value the free services that we offer, if you take advantage of our webinars and clinical seminars regularly, please consider a donation. You can make a gift on our website, cmhrc.org/donate, which will take you to our safe and secure online giving platform. Now, tonight, we're going to be presenting some information. Please put your questions either into the chat or into the Q&A box. I will be monitoring that during the presentation. we will either be integrating the questions during, or we will have a full Q&A at the end where we will get to the questions that have been asked. We may not get to your exact questions. Sometimes when there are multiple questions that are basically the same, we will combine them and answer them together. But please feel free to put them in there. Don't raise your hand. We won't be calling on people to speak during the presentation, but if you put your questions in the chat or Q&A, we will get to them. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter for the evening, Jennifer Sevick. She is a licensed independent social worker. She is CMHRC's clinical coordinator, and she is here to talk to us tonight about the limbic system and de-escalation and regulation. So, Jen, why don't you get us started talking about what we're going to learn tonight?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm so glad to be here and to share with you how we connect our knowledge of the limbic system to help us de-escalate in a crisis and in a mood disorder. So tonight we're going to focus our attention on recognizing 3 roles the limbic system plays in symptoms and behaviors associated with mood disorders and bipolar in children and adolescents. We'll also learn ways to de-escalate symptoms in a child or adolescent in times of crisis or when the limbic system is dysregulated.
So, Jen, you and I both know that practitioners tend to focus on cognitive behavioral strategies for modifying behavior in kids, but that's not really always the best approach, at least not initially, for kids.
Yeah, we do say that traditional cognitive and behavioral approaches are often effective treatment interventions initially in children and teenagers living with mood disorders. We've talked about the fact that symptoms, which are often misidentified as, quote, problem behaviors, can leave parents, teachers, and providers frustrated, and they really don't know what other strategies to try.
Well, we always say here at CMHRC that behaviors are actually just observable symptoms. They have some physiological or biological cause, even if we don't know what it is.
Right. And that's why we're going to start off with looking at these observable symptoms that are often rooted in limbic dysregulation. We'll review what the limbic system is and the key structures involved in that system related to mood disorders. And we're going to identify symptoms of mood disorder that are often influenced by a dysregulated limbic system, learn why mood disorders are thought to be a metabolic disorder, and how energy impacts that system.
Jen, I just want to interject here that we talk a lot about the DSM and in our other seminars and webinars, and there's actually a lot of concern about the DSM and the problems that it has related to cause. We all know that the DSM doesn't actually even address cause. They intentionally decided to not include any consideration of cause when they designed DSM-3 back in 1980, and that philosophy is carried through DSM-4 and DSM-5 as well. Amy, I see that you raised your hand. Please put your comment in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will get to it when we have finished the presentation. Thank you. Jen, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you're right. And so the DSM-5 actually has been widely criticized for over pathologizing human behaviors, making what are normal behavioral responses a medical issue. And another area of concern is the emphasis on medication management without any real understanding where the biological causes are stemming from. So it has been argued that a classification system should really be based on the understanding of brain-based biology.
Okay, but I'm going to jump in here for a second, and I'm going to ask you the question that we get over and over and over again from parents and teachers, which is, how do you tell the difference between symptoms of a mood disorder versus a child just being oppositional. You and I, of course, have spent a lot of time learning how to tell the difference and how to recognize when it's one versus the other. Um, but I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that whether it's a symptom or not, behavior is a method of communication. And that when kids are behaving in a certain way, it's information for us as caregivers and educators on what they need. And so I'd like us to help our audience sort of understand a little bit better how to differentiate between behaviors and symptoms.
Right. So I think it's important to remember that to be a disorder, symptoms must be caused by a dysfunction. Disorder inherently involves both harmful symptoms tracked by severity and dysfunction in inferred failure of psychological mechanism to perform its biological function. And in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk, MD, he wrote, with DSM-5 psychiatry firmly regressed to an early 19th century medical practice, despite the fact that we know the origin of many of the problems it identifies. Its diagnoses describe surface phenomena that completely ignore the underlying causes.
Okay, Jen, can you give us an example of this, because this seems a little, maybe like it might be a little abstract.
Yeah, I can. And in fact, Vanderkolk does this, right? So he provides an example of a person diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder, when in reality, the behavior is rooted in an attempt to protect himself against real danger.
So I know we've talked about it before, but can you give some examples of the DSM's flaws?
Yeah, one example of the DSM-5 is a failure to acknowledge behaviors as having underlying biological causes. So, a failure to understand the underlying cause of the symptoms lends to a higher rate of misdiagnosis and patients receiving ineffective treatment plans as a result. And when we know that the physiological structures are involved in symptom presentation, we can use targeted interventions and treatment with actually a higher degree of confidence that they'll be effective. And this is especially true, Elizabeth, when we have an up to date information about current research into what's causing these structures and symptoms to be either overactive or underactive. So, in part one of this series, we actually went into a lot of detail on the limbic system.
And let me just jump in here for one quick second. If you missed that seminar, it is available for viewing on our member page, for anyone who's a professional member or a family member of CMHRC. You can view that at your convenience on the membership page.
So during that seminar, we focused on three main structures. We focused on the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. The limbic system regulates the release of neurotransmitters, and those are hormones that communicate to other parts of the brain and body. And when there is a dysregulation or dysfunction in that limbic system, there are some observable biological symptoms that can be witnessed. And these symptoms are also symptoms of mood disorder, and they're symptoms of bipolar disorder as well.
So this sounds like it's a validation of van der Kolk's idea that there's actually a biological basis for all of these disorders that we're finding in the DSM.
Exactly. And failure to understand the role of these biological symptoms, well, that can lead to a high rate of misdiagnosis.
So when we understand the biological causes, um, it seems to me like it becomes pretty obvious that the way to reduce episodes or quickly resolve episodes that occur when kids and adults are in active distress is to address the underlying cause. So can you give us some examples of that?
Sure. So, examples of biological processes that the limbic system influences includes things like temperature regulation, sleep-wake cycles, circadian rhythm, and disruptions in these processes lead to symptoms of things like depression. We can see mania, disassociation, and fear. And so when we examine each of the structures in the limbic system, we can see the limbic structures which are involved in mood disorder and bipolar symptom presentation. And it's not just mood disorders and bipolar. We also see the limbic system connection in things like anxiety disorders, ADHD, autism, and even PTSD. So it's important to understand what the biological or root cause is because some of these disorders have overlapping symptoms. And so, if we don't understand what the biological cause is, that can really lead to misdiagnosis. And this is the detective work that clinicians usually legitimately find very difficult.
Agreed. It's difficult and it's time consuming. And that's actually part of what we try to do with our diagnostic program, consultation program, is to work with providers and say, look, you've got documentation requirements, you've got a waiting list of patients, you've got demands from insurance reimbursers, and let us help you with some of that detective work and sort of figuring out what fits, what symptom goes with what diagnosis, and what are we actually seeing here. But it sounds like what you're saying to me is that was something that we sort of keep banging a drum about at CMHRC, which is that bipolar disorder, mood disorders, they're not behavioral disorders. They're biological disorders, and they have a physiological root.
Yeah, so the massive expenditure of energy in the human brain actually makes it one of the most energy demanding organs. And the limbic system's role in regulation and coordination of the brain and body utilizes more synaptic activity, requiring more energy than any other part of the brain. And according to Harvard School of Medicine, the brain uses over half of all the sugar energy or glucose in the body. And so, in recent years, researchers around the world actually have begun to think of unipolar depression and bipolar disorder as a mitochondrial disease or energy disorder rather than actually a psychiatric condition. And it makes sense then that if bipolar is an energy disorder, that the areas of the brain that require the most energy are significantly impacted. And there's overwhelming evidence that metabolic disease has a real role in psychiatric illnesses.
It's always interesting to me when you bring this up because this really is the direction that most researchers are going in at this point. It's the framework that they're using for looking at treatment and understanding the biological roots of bipolar disorder. In fact, last year at a conference of researchers from around the world, a huge percentage were looking at mitochondria. They were looking at metabolism. They were looking at the ways that sugar and energy impacts symptoms of bipolar disorder.
Yeah, so mitochondrial disorders cause disruptions of energy, Elizabeth, on a cellular level. And that can occur at any age.
And that supports what we're always telling people, which is that bipolar disorder, major depression, mood disorders that many people think are relegated to adulthood aren't, that children can get them at any time, because it's something going on in their cells.
Right. So pediatric onset of bipolar or even major depressive disorder is often considered rare, and therefore it can be controversial to diagnose. But the reality is that mitochondrial dysfunction and its associated disorders, well, that can present at any age.
So this is why there's no minimum or maximum age at which you can diagnose bipolar disorder and mood disorders.
Right. People often don't realize that kids as young as 5 or 6 years old can have these mood disorders because they think to themselves, how can I have a 5-year-old who's clinically depressed? And what does even a 5-year-old have to be depressed about, anyways? But when you look at it as a mitochondrial dysfunction in the cells, then you can accept that this can occur at any time.
Okay, so explain to us what mitochondria is, since it's so important.
Right. Yeah. So the National Genome Research Institute defines mitochondria as a membrane bound organelles or structures that are located within a cell that produce energy. And that energy travels across complex pathways to supply other structures and organs in the body. And when there is a defect or defects along the pathways, this creates that mitochondrial dysfunction. In the limbic system, this means that parts of the limbic structures are thought to be either over or underactive, contributing to psychiatric symptoms that we can observe. So, for example, you can see if someone is experiencing, say, psychomotor agitation or increased psychomotor activity. This would be signs of hypomania or mania, and then decreased psychomotor activity, which would be signs of depression. You can also observe if someone is overheating, that would be the hypothalamus, or if they're experiencing fear and discover they maybe misinterpreted a tone of voice, and that would be the amygdala.
So it seems like there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that there's a link between the limbic system functions and neuropsychiatric disorders, which would lead me as a mental health provider to think that the way to best address the problems that result from this limbic system dysregulation is to really understand how the limbic system is working in the first place, and to have that whole body perspective.
Exactly. So, another important reason why it's imperative to care about the limbic system in relation to mood disorder is the idea of kindling posed by Dr. Robert Post. So, Dr. Post's research led to a theory that initial episodes of mood disorders are influenced by major psychosocial stressors. And as the disease progresses over time, that stress threshold is lowered for subsequent episodes to where the episodes become more and more just automatic. And if interventions are delayed or their maybe appropriate care is not provided, then mood episodes are likely to become more frequent, and that's that rapid cycling, and more intense. So, intervening with appropriate strategies and interventions at early stages of illness can significantly reduce the frequency and the intensity of future episodes. It is accurate to say that the kindling process takes place within that limbic system.
So, so Jen, this sounds to me a lot like something that we talk about all the time, which is that parents need to meet the need of the child who is experiencing this distress and dysregulation. But a lot of times when they do that, um, teachers, mental health professionals, coaches will tell the parent that they're giving in or letting the child win or enabling them by giving them what they need. But this concept of kindling is not, we're not teaching them to manipulate or misbehave when we give them what they need. We're giving them what they need. And this research by Dr. Post really seems to support that. And it reminds me of the fact that, Dr. Dimitri Popoulos, who wrote the book The Bipolar Child, I worked with him for many years. And one of the things that he always used to say is when a child becomes dysregulated and their limbic system is the system that's driving what's happening to them, we need to get them out of that limbic system response as quickly as possible, so that the next time they become distressed, they become less likely to go into their limbic response, or if they do, that they will stay there for a shorter period of time, and that's really the root behind why we meet the need when a child is dysregulated.
Exactly. So, this is why it's particularly important when considering a mood disorder or bipolar diagnosis, because delays in appropriate care means that kindling of the disease process and the trajectory of that illness for those with early onset has a high morbidity and mortality rate. By recognizing symptoms earlier, if a full presentation of the disorder has not yet been manifested, there is the potential to lower the risks associated with them. And those risks include things like suicide, substance and alcohol use disorders, sexually risky behavior, and even not completing high school and or college. And so, for example, with bipolar disorder, it's estimated between 4 to approximately 6% of the population lives with bipolar disorder. When one parent lives with bipolar, the risk to their child for developing bipolar is it's about 15 to 30%. So when both parents live with bipolar, that risk then jumps up to between 50 and 75%, which means by most medical standards, having one parent with a history of bipolar is considered high risk. But really, if there are two parents living with bipolar, more likely than not, that child is probably going to develop the illness at some point in their life.
Yeah, Jen, there are a lot of scary statistics out there that go along with bipolar disorder and make it extremely important to understand the ramifications of what happens when this disorder goes untreated. Bipolar 1 has a lifetime prevalence rate of developing substance abuse disorders of 40%, and bipolar 2 has a lifetime prevalence rate of 20%. So imagine being a parent who's been told their child has a 30% chance of developing bipolar disorder, and then you know that there's a 40% chance that they will develop a substance abuse disorder. As a parent, I would want to be very proactive in assessing and treating signs and symptoms of bipolar, even in its prodromal stages. And we'd want to make changes in how we parent and what our expectations are of that child's. And I would think I would want to be focusing on how to use the limbic system to help dysregulate, and help the child stay regulated. And I think as providers, we owe it to our patients to be able to explain this information to them and provide interventions that aren't just based on cognitive behavioral approaches, but that are based on using the science behind the causes of these symptoms to help manage them and to reduce the intensity and frequency of symptoms. So statistics also show us that 20 to 60% of the 6 million people who live with bipolar disorder attempt to end their life. And bipolar has one of the highest completion rates, with nearly 20% who do, in fact, die by suicide. Um, so that is a lot of people who are at risk for death. And if left untreated, these are the consequences. We have an average that the CDC and NIMH estimate that it takes 10 years from the time that symptoms start to present until a person gets an accurate diagnosis and treatment for bipolar disorder, mood disorders, and other mental illnesses. And when you have 20 to 60% of people with bipolar disorder attempting to end their life and 20% succeeding, 10 years is just way too long to wait. We also know from research that among patients with bipolar 1, 61% had a lifetime history of drug and alcohol abuse disorders. 46% had a lifetime history of alcohol, and 41 had drug abuse or dependence, and that approximately 70%, a huge number, 70% of college students living with bipolar end up leaving college. And one study found that young persons with bipolar disorder were at a higher risk of sexually transmitted infections compared with their peers who were not living with bipolar disorder.
Yeah, so if we're not treating the dysfunction, then the person will need to find a way to relieve that discomfort and distress that they are experiencing. And really, they're looking for the best way they can to find a way to cope with their symptoms. Unfortunately, using these tools for comfort is an unhealthy way to attempt to regulate a dysregulated limbic system, and these are very adult ways of coping. Even teenagers find their way of coping with these things. But fortunately, children often don't have the agency or the resources to offset some of these symptoms in the way that adults or older teens can. And so that's why they are flipping over the desk. They're playing video games for way too long. They're eating, their parents at a house and home. It's not, going to look the same way in children when they're trying to, meet their needs and cope, but nonetheless, it's still a very dysregulated limbic system, which, if unaddressed in children, will likely develop into one of these more adult forms of self-medicating as they move from adolescence to adulthood.
Okay, so how is the limbic system working here?
Well, the structures in the limbic system allow for a release of hormones, which are the body's chemical messengers. And hormones are responsible for communication between structures and organs throughout the brain and the body. These disruptions in the connectivity process contribute to psychiatric symptoms. It's theorized that things like sleep, sadness, aggression, shutting down, mania, temperature overheating, paranoia, obsessive thoughts, dissociative symptoms, hypersexuality, this fight, flight, freeze response. Well, these are symptoms that we can observe that involve a dysregulated limbic system, and there are more symptoms, of course, Elizabeth, but we're going to focus on the ones that we can actually more easily observe.
Okay, so let's take a look at what these very common symptoms are.
Yeah, let's look at the common symptoms of bipolar, which in many cases are also seen in major depressive and disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, or DMDD. We have these very common symptoms that we see of separation anxiety, explosive rages, irritability, oppositional or defiant appearing behaviors, rapid cycling, complaints of body temperature dysregulation. We see aggression, intense carb craving, lying to avoid getting into trouble. And additional common symptoms include things like hypersexuality, paranoia, obsessive or fixated behaviors. Nearly all of these symptoms actually stem from limbic dysregulation.
So, Jen, since some people weren't with us last month, can you give just a really brief overview of the limbic structures that we talked about so they can see how it connects?
Yeah, sure. So let's look for a moment at three of those structures. We said the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. The amygdala is responsible for fear, irritability, anxiety, aggression, even perception of tactile information, interpreting tone, interpreting touch, and body language. Also, for appetite, that's that carb craving, lying, and even sexual arousal. So, the hypothalamus is responsible for sleep and wake cycles, circadian rhythm, temperature, weight, blood pressure, hunger, thirst, and mood. And then we have the hippocampus, and that's involved in long-term memory, memory retrieval, dissociation, and spatial navigation. And it's interesting to note one study on visuospatial memory and bipolar noted that individuals who live with more depressive episodes experience significant deficits and visual spatial memory. So let's imagine a teenager being told to get on their shoes, their backpack, coat, and 10 minutes later, they reported to their parents they can't find it. And then the parents, they get so frustrated, they might think that their child is just being lazy, always losing their items, never being able to find, necessary things in their home. And children and adolescents living with bipolar, they might at that point have a full-blown meltdown or rage because they're really sensing that their parent, through the parent's tone of voice and maybe their body language, that they're frustrated. And so that's the amygdala at work, and the child likely feels scared, and the amygdala is interpreting this situation as truly life-threatening. And the reality is that that visual processing is impaired temporarily by limbic dysfunction. And so the common perception of all of this is that these children and adolescents are being manipulative. We hear that a lot, lazy or attention seeking. And in reality, it's a preservation of self at all costs. It's not manipulation, and it's really just an attempt to have order and to have safety. So I think we've all heard Benjamin Franklin's famous saying. He says, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." Well, we know that there's no cure at this time for psychiatric illnesses, and but many parents can tell you that they can predict with fairly good accuracy when their child is going to have a complete meltdown or lose it or become dysregulated. So it's typical to hear a parent say things like, "I knew this was going to happen. I knew we should not have come." But parents really are experts on their children. And that's why here at the Children's Mental Health Resource Center, we call them parent professionals. They know their children's symptoms, they know their children's triggers, and they know the best ways to de escalate the situation. So over time, they've become experts in anticipating what those triggers are and the best way to handle that situation. But despite being experts, sometimes parents are stuck. And most of us would say we cannot stand, well, most of us, I think, would say that we can't not send our child to school, or sometimes teachers and school administrators are really reluctant to make the necessary accommodations from school. And they kind of sometimes perceive this as parents enabling their child, and they don't really want children to have what we call learned avoidance.
So, Jen, this really connects to the concept that we talk about and we work with, which we call palliative parenting. And the fact that we coach parents all the time on trusting their instincts and telling them that it is okay for them to say no to things. It's okay for them to say, "I understand what my child can handle and what my child can't." That by setting my child up for success, I'm actually teaching them more about how to live in the world than if I let them fail, and become dysregulated in the process. So it's okay to say no to obligations.
Yes, it is, which brings us to the question that all parents have, almost universally, which is, how do we deal with this then? So, what do we do to help de escalate when my child is dysregulated? And, from for uh, one of the most frequent concerns that our parents and teachers have is about this fight, flight, and freeze response. It can show up as being physical or verbally aggressive at home, at school, even out in public. And it can also show up as aggressively shutting down. And the child or adolescent who puts their head down on the table, they'll stare straight ahead, they won't talk, they seem immovable. And at this point, this can be seen as being oppositional, stubborn, and disrespectful. And in reality, these are not behaviors that we're witnessing. At this point, these are symptoms of internal physiological symptoms that should really honestly be treated as biological. But what parents say is, what do we do in these stressful situations? And for parents, one tool that they have is their instincts. If they know that something is going to cause their child to become irritable, anxious, ragey, or shut down, then it's worth paying attention to what their inner voice is telling them.
And can I just say here that it is not pessimism to know what your child's triggers are, that when you say, no, he's not going to be able to handle that, or she's going to have trouble managing that, it's not diminishing the child, it's recognizing the reality of their capacity.
Right. It's okay to decline invitations or skip out on an activity. And it's okay to make alternative plans that are better suited for that child, even if that means respectfully declining a holiday dinner at grandma's house, where all the extended family are going to be there. And a parent can say to extended family, you know what, this year we'll be eating at home. And if you like, we can stop by tomorrow or later on in the week for lunch. One family that we know whose child lives with juvenile bipolar said that they would tell grandparents that they were scheduled to work on holidays, and then they would go to Waffle House stress free. So another perspective, another approach to use is the explicit exit strategy. And that can mean that the parent or the child agree to stay at a party for an hour and then go home or maybe go out and have some ice cream or something afterwards. And so families who they can have code words that they can use to signal that, hey, it's time to leave. And many parents of a children who live with bipolar will bring separate cars. And so there's one car for the child who may become dysregulated, but then there's another car for the siblings so that they can stay and enjoy themselves. And this really does prevent animosity between like siblings and parents, that they have to leave early. And it can also be a trusted friend who comes to pick up that child and take them home or to bring your other children home later. So it can look like even calling ahead to the aunt or grandmother's house, making arrangements for your child to have a quiet space, a place to lie down and take a break. It may be bringing familiar foods to eat instead of the prepared holiday feast. So, anxiety around unfamiliar smells, sensory sensitivities, a difference in routine, and new people, that all can actually contribute to dysregulation. So, another proactive strategy for parents is to call ahead of time the host, find out what to expect, and then give the parent and the child the option of attending, declining the invitation, or just maybe attending for like just a little bit of time. One parent of an autistic child, when they throw parties, they print out invitations with menus. They have all the drinks listed on there. They have locations of all the quiet spaces that are available throughout their house. And they give very specific details on the environment. So clinicians can normalize parents calling ahead and framing it as effective parenting instead of as many parents think of this as a burden or making the host feel awkward about asking all these things. Parents can rehearse with therapists, and they can practice these scripts, and they can say, "Hey, my child has some sensitivities, and I'd like to let them know what to expect, so that you know what, we can all have a good time here." So parents, unaware that these are dysregulated symptoms, are that these are actually a medical situation, And they unfortunately believe that their child might be attention seeking and manipulative. And they've said it's really unfair that everyone else in the family, brothers and sisters, have to suffer just because of one child. And here's where, professionals can play a big part because as the provider, we can help parents reframe this as an acute medical urgency, um, because they are a medical urgency. And simply by taking care of your child's biological needs, you're really helping them. And so this is exactly the same as if a child is experiencing a low blood sugar or having a seizure. The typical strategies that have been encouraged to try are things like sticker charts, reward charts, positive reinforcement only after successfully completing a task, setting up behavior contracts, and following through on the punishment. And the idea being that you don't want that child to have learned avoidance or to grow up being like, quote, a brat. But for kids living with mental health conditions with symptoms beyond their control, these approaches are usually ineffective and they're actually quite damaging to the child's self esteem and their sense of safety. And I also want to point out here that it's really damaging between the parent child relationship as well. So, clinicians can encourage parents to write down common reoccurring triggers, situations that they know that are going to overwhelm their children. And this helps facilitate alternative options that do not cause that same level of stress or dysregulation. And Elizabeth, while this may seem really simple, the truth is that the more we force a dysregulated child to participate or to be in an environment that isn't meeting their biological and their physiological needs, then the less likely they are to be able to regulate themselves in the future. And so the child will have stored these negative associations in their hippocampus, which are not only an effective method, but it's really detrimental towards long term goals. So it's better to say that the child who is anxious and fearful, let's say about math, that after the child is done with math, let's go to the park. But maybe the child only did one math problem out of the 10 that were assigned, or maybe they didn't. Maybe they just flipped open the math book and they looked at it for a few minutes and then put it down. But that child is communicating they are done with math. So guess what? They get to go to the park. Eventually, children do learn that attempting math is not at all fearful and it's not threatening. It may take dozens of trips to the park, but the key is associating that undesirable, scary activity with a fun memory or safe memory. And so providing this psychoeducation to families is really vital for promoting a sense of safety and trust in that parent-child relationship. So additional proactive strategies that reduce limbic dysregulation, we've talked about this so much here, is light therapy, cooling strategies, exercise, diet, sleep, and hygiene.
So
So, oh, you
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted to jump in here and say that we bang this drum too. Circadian rhythms, sleep disruptions are a symptom of pretty much every mood disorder. Um, and so when we're seeing a kid who can't fall asleep, who can't wind down in the evening in order to be able to sleep, who can't stay asleep, is a restless sleeper, is up a half a dozen times a night, then suddenly in the morning, in the early morning hours, they fall into a deep sleep and can't wake up. A lot of families go to their pediatricians with these complaints about their sleep. My child won't nap. My child won't go to sleep at night. these can be early indicators of a mood disorder. And they, despite the fact that they are physical symptoms, doesn't mean that they can't also be a symptom of a mood disorder. And so it's really, really important to work on getting those circadian rhythms aligned properly so that the child is sleeping when it is nighttime and awake when it is daytime. But this has this biological cause. It stems from the hypothalamus.
Right, but how many times do we hear people say that they're just wanting your attention, right? Or they're just trying to stay up a lot later, and they're not really realizing that there is this biological reason for delays. And we see that so often. My child requires me to rub their back. They require me to do 2 stories, to sing them this many times, and even older kids that delay their and so we rarely think of it as that there's this biological, reason for that, and that the hypothalamus really isn't regulating all of this stuff the way that it needs to be.
So some interventions that families can use at home that are inexpensive and really easy to implement at low risk, high reward, are using light therapeutically. And that includes dawn simulators, dusk simulators, limiting blue light, and making sure they get early morning sunlight exposure on a daily basis. Those types of things help the hypothalamus do what it's not able to do super well, which is regulate those circadian rhythms. Using certain types of melatonin, I know melatonin has been in the news lately as being something that parents are using too much of. You don't actually need 5, 10, 15 milligrams of melatonin. The really the good melatonins are 1 milligram that are spread out over the course, in a slow release capsule throughout the night. So you're giving a really low dose, but it's very targeted. And really low risk is putting fans in a bedroom to increase air circulation, to cooling down the temperatures in the bedroom, because the cooler the room is, the better sleep quality anyone will get, whether they have a mood disorder or a disruption in their hypothalamus or not.
So we talked about that last seminar that or webinar that we did, right? Melatonin's function is to actually lower your body temperature, and
To
it's
prepare
really
you for sleep.
right, it's preparing you for sleep. And so that's why doctors say have a cool room, have the fans going in your room because you're cooling and you're lowering that body temperature, which is it's hinting, hey, it's time to go to bed.
Now, quality sleep is really important for the limbic system to be able to function properly. And there's a really intimate connection there between emotional regulation and sleep quality. Um, Jen, did you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, parents sometimes will say, "Well, my child or my teen doesn't have a problem with sleep. Like they go to bed and then they wake up." And there are aspects of this that we may be missing. And this is that detective work that we talk about. So in order to actually get really good quality sleep, you need to stay in the stages of sleep for X amount of time. And you can't go over that amount of time in each stage, and you can't have under the minutes that you need. It's actually really specific set times that you move through these stages. And some of those stages include cementing learning from that day. So if you are moving too quickly or not spending enough time in a specific stage, then what happens is we're not cementing that learning and we're not able to retrieve that information the way someone would if they get quality sleep. And so our memory can be impacted. Our knowledge integration is there, and then of course that irritability, right? And it can trigger in people with depression or bipolar disorder, like it can trigger psychomotor agitation, mania, hypomania. So is really something that is crucial for preventing dysregulation.
So I want to move on to more about what we can do. So emotional regulation and temperature regulation are really connected. We talk about this when you talk about the hypothalamus regulating body temperature. It's and when it can't do that, it contributes to irritability, it contributes to fight or flight, it contributes to reactive aggressive behaviors. And being able to use temperature regulating interventions is really something very simple that families can do at home immediately. This just means turn on your ceiling fans and leave them running counterclockwise in to keep you cool. It means using cooling towels, drinking lots of ice water and cold water, eating frozen snacks, submerging the body. That's the best way to help regulate body temperature is submersion in a swimming pool or in a bathtub, using cooling sheets and mattress toppers for sleep at night, and wearing moisture wicking athletic clothes.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was going to say, and these are things that we can employ inside a classroom. If you think about anxiety and just how that raises our stress level, and we get a little bit hotter and we get a more flush, right? Our heart rate increases. And so, as a teacher, just offering cold water, offering a popsicle, those types of things. And so rather than a kid flipping over a desk before, because a teacher can predict these things just as well as a parent can over
Mhm.
time, you just get to know that kid. And think about like you just offer them a popsicle and it kind of disrupts everything that's happening and they're just focused on that. And it really is an intervention to de-escalate that kid.
Now, a lot of people, Jen, don't know about the impact that psychiatric medications can have on body temperature regulation. And so I do want to just take a minute here to give you the opportunity to talk about what some antipsychotic and antidepressant medications can do.
Um, yeah, so antipsychotic medication can actually decrease your ability to tolerate heat. And then, of course, it's going to cause increased sweating. And that is going to then trigger all the different processes in your limbic system. And that's, when we're going to see the aggressiveness that comes with that. And we're not often told about that when we have an SSRI, right? When we have Lexapro or something on board, they're not going to tell you that that's going to increase their ability or to be able to tolerate some of these things. So if you are a child who has a family history of mood disorders or you are dysregulated, we really need to be aware of this and to be on the lookout for temperature dysregulation. So the flushing of the face, the hands and the feet. And it's not just about, we often look for Elizabeth, when they overheat, because you can see the red ears and things like that.
Right.
But also, they can have dysregulation for temperature all over so that they can have cold hands and
Right.
cold feet. Right. And so it's not necessarily always running hot. It's running cold when you really should not be running cold. So we really want to look for those signs of temperature dysregulation. And unfortunately, it can occur all in the same child or adult, doesn't matter. So like you can be hot and flushed, but then in certain parts of your body, but your hands might be icy cold. You're just kind of
Right.
dysregulated all over.
And I think it's really important to for parents excuse me, for parents and for therapists, social workers, occupational therapists, for other folks who are working with families to understand and advocate when a child is showing maybe that prodrome for a mood disorder or bipolar, when they go to the prescriber, for those folks who are on the team to be able to say, let's pause before we give an antipsychotic, because for the most part those are the first things that will be prescribed to a child: the Seroquel, a Risperdal, an Abilify. And when those cause disruptions in the body's ability to regulate temperature and heat and sweating and dehydration becomes a risk. The team really needs to be able to stand up for that kid and say, maybe we need to rethink this medication choice and look at some more traditional mood stabilizers and interventions here that are not going to further disrupt that system. And to go along with that, I think it seems pretty obvious to most people that diet and exercise are important, um, but they are really important when it comes to brain health and managing mental health conditions. Jen, can you talk a little bit about why?
Yeah, so if we think about it as a mitochondrial issue, right, an energy disorder, then what exercise is going to be doing is it's going to be helping to increase that energy, and so it really helps us to give a boost, and we want to do it at strategic times. So we talked about this in our last webinar with parents that you don't want to exercise or even adults like on the treadmill right before they go to bed because you're telling your body to become more alert and to wake up. You want to be able to exercise at key moments and really be able to implement that part of your daily routine or weekly routine, so that you're better able to regulate those parts of the body. And then, of course, diet is a huge part. More and more research, when we look at it from a metabolic standpoint, um, we're really seeing that certain types of things, the westernized diet is interfering on a cellular level. And people, it's really kind of interesting because people always question whether or not a ketogenic diet is safe, but nobody ever asks whether or not a westernized diet is safe.
Right, all that processed food and high fructose corn syrup.
Right. And so how can you argue that whole foods, right? Real, what I call real foods,
Hmm.
how could you argue that real food is unsafe? Because ketogenic diet means a lot of things. Ketogenic means that it is not processed. It means that it is limiting your carbs. It's not no carbs, by the way. It just means that you are very mindful about where those carbohydrates are coming from.
Right.
And it is really limiting sugars. And so to it makes me kind of chuckle when people say, "Well, isn't it safe?" And I think about our westernized diet, and I'm like, "Oh, I don't know that's really safe." Um,
So
but
Um,
uh,
I just wanted to say, Karen, I saw that you raised your hand. Again, we're not responding to raised hands. Please go ahead and put your comment or question into the Q&A. We have another half an hour of the seminar, and so we're going to finish up the presentation, and then we're going to answer all those questions. So we will get to you. You're right, Jen. The metabolic lens that researchers are using now to look at treatment for psychiatric disorders is really demonstrating a tremendous amount of promise, and that switching to ketogenic eating and ketogenic therapy, as you said, it's not any one kind of diet. There's a Mediterranean ketogenic diet. There's vegetarian ketogenic diets. It really isn't about one prescribed set of rules. It can be applied in many different ways, really showing tremendous promise. But we do want to just say as a disclaimer that we understand that diet and exercise are not going to cure a mental illness, but they can go a long way towards mitigating symptoms that significantly diminish quality of life.
And one thing to note is that there are some really good psychiatrists that are out there, and they're talking about this. Doctors that were trained through Harvard that are associated with McLean hospital system, and they're talking about this metabolic diet. And what they're finding isn't that necessarily people go off all their medications, that they are able to take
Pare back.
less. Yes,
Yes.
significantly as they're doing this and feeling better, you
Right.
know? if you're eating a cleaner diet, wouldn't we would, any of us, it doesn't matter whether you have a psychiatric illness or not, any of us would actually feel quite better.
Absolutely. So, some other accommodations that we really think are important for parents to learn, either with the support of their therapist or not on their own, are accommodations that involve really removing the concept of blame and focusing on flexibility in our interactions with our children and remaining sensitive to the child's needs. You know, the International Bipolar Foundation, on their website, they offer a lot of examples of accommodations that are consistent with being, proactive and helpful during times of dysregulation. And one of the things that we hear over and over again, going back to what we said before, is that parents are concerned, teachers are concerned that being sensitive to the child's needs is coddling. But when we really get down to brass tacks and we talk about what we are asking for in terms of accommodations, it's really not anything that is so outrageous. We're talking about accommodations like having access to ice water. Kids who have mood disorders when they're on medications, as we said, those medications can be dehydrating. Those medications can have certain issues of toxicity if they are not, if they don't drink enough water. Being able to have access to ice water in a bathroom is not an unreasonable accommodation. It's not going to tax any classroom so severely. Giving a child frequent breaks when they're feeling anxious at school, shortening assignments. It's not uncommon for kids who have learning disabilities or other cognitive or academic issues to be given an accommodation in their IEP that says, okay, instead of doing 20 math problems for homework, you're going to do 10, and you can do every other problem, so that you're not just doing the first 10 that are easier. We're actually seeing your level of mastery. That's an appropriate accommodation for someone who has mental health challenges as well, or having a modified school day with circadian rhythm disruptions. Some kids just can't get there at 7:45 when the school day starts, and allowing them to come in a little late or to leave a little early, or to have a place in the nurse's office where they can go and lie down if their stamina flags. These are incredibly appropriate and easy to implement accommodations.
One of the things I hear from teachers and even parents is that my child is capable of doing this work, all of this work, or the teachers are saying, but they're capable of doing all this work.
They did
But
it
think about
yesterday, they can do it today.
right, but if you have a dysregulated limbic system, sometimes you can and sometimes you cannot. It depends on whether or not you're regulated. And also, if you look at it from a metabolic standpoint, that this is an energy disorder, right? Sometimes we don't have the energy. We're looking at 10 math problems. And if you're talking about algebra 2, or if you're talking about calculus, right? Those math problems can be pages long. And
Right.
so these simply just don't have the energy to be able to do it. Yes, they're capable of it when they're regulated, but when they're dysregulated or they don't have enough energy to be able to do it, we need to make the accommodations, and we have to trust them that when they're telling us, like, I just don't have it in me. Okay, I
Right.
trust you to know that.
So, Jen, this brings us to something that we talk to a lot of people about, which is applied behavioral analysis, or ABA therapy, which is extremely popular. And it uses positive reinforcement as a main strategy for decreasing what adults have determined to be undesirable behaviors. And the goal is to help the child become more capable of functioning in their environment. But there's a issue with this intervention that makes it not always appropriate for a kid who has a mood disorder. Jen, can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. So looking at ABA as or applied behavioral analysis as a treatment, It uses positive reinforcement as a main strategy, and it uses it to decrease unwanted or undesirable behaviors in an effort for the child to exhibit more acceptable behaviors that would allow the person to function more effectively in their environment. But this behavioral approach focuses on the antecedent, so what comes before, then the behavior, and then the consequences for that behavior. The assumption being that it's an observable trigger that can be detected, and that child is responding to an external stimulus or an internal thought or feeling, and that the responses of the therapist or adult can influence change by either positive reinforcement or by no reaction at all. And this comes from this description from Autism Speaks. And
Right.
so the child with a mood disorder, for whom there really is no external trigger, right? This is all the limbic system here, dysregulation. So rather, they're experiencing involuntary internal mood fluctuations from that dysregulated limbic system. And so to ignore them as a consequence, you're basically ignoring a medical urgency, right? So imagine not feeling as if those people are meeting your really your life-threatening medical emergency as you view that. So,
So,
it oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, Jen.
Well, so we mentioned that this was, a medical event, and that positive reinforcement or non-responsiveness, during that medical crisis would be really ineffective, right? And so long term, that's not really gonna bode well, for that parent-child relationship there. And so it's imperative that regulation and stabilization be the primary objective for any psychotherapy intervention that is being implemented. So that's any behavioral strategy across the board. We really want to make sure, like, is this a quote behavior, or is this biological in nature?
Yeah, this is something that we talk about all the time with providers when we explain to them that behavior modification can't be your focus at the beginning. It has to be about relationship building. And then with a child who has a mood disorder, that relationship building is going to take longer. It is going to be harder, one. And, but in the end, it's that relationship that's going to be used to assist healing and in promoting health and healthy interactions. Now, I do see we are starting to run out of time, and we have some really good information that we still have to get to. So I want to try to move a little bit faster through these resources. Um, there are some books that you want to mention here, Jen, and encourage people to read because they really explain how that relationship can be used to maximal benefit.
Yeah, so Gary Landreth, he is known for play therapy, and there's four things that he points out that all children want. So they all want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want someone that is like physically there with them, and they want to be understood. And that's not just children; that's like universal, adults,
Right.
teenagers, children. But safety is honestly that when you do that relationship, that is the most important thing. So that relationship is going to be the one that is healing and driving that recovery process, whether that's the parent, and the therapist and the providers who are partnering and teaming up with those parents.
So he also talks about key facts to remember in a crisis.
Yeah, so what we need to remember is that this is a medical crisis and not a bad kid in need of
Mhm.
consequences. So behavioral therapy approaches, when the symptoms are biologically driven, do not see what is the underlying cause. And that's why it's not effective in regulating the body. So, cognitive and behavioral therapeutic skill sets are most effective when the person is stable. Prior to stability, looking for ways to regulate and achieve stability must be really honestly the priority there. And we, of course, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so we we know that cognitive and behavioral interventions, they do work eventually. And as providers, we shift the responsibility of the behavioral changes to the adults and to the caregivers in the environment. So we're going to encourage cognitive shifts in the parents and the teachers and the caregivers so that the child who lives with mental illness has the time to heal and is later available to do that cognitive, behavioral, or dialectical or trauma work. But it's going to take really having them stable in order to be able to do that.
So I love the part where he talks about saying I understand isn't agreement. It doesn't mean that you are validating an irrational or disconnected thought that does not connect to reality. It's not saying you're right, I am unfair. It's saying that you're sending a signal to the child that you're trying to understand them, and that attempt to understand leads to trust and partnership and collaboration.
Right. I
The
think,
another great, oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, you collaboration is the best part of that, right? So it's like this partnership that we're having. So really when we're talking about fight, flight, or freeze, when we're talking about um, that those meltdowns and those rages and the tense shutting down, um, Ross Green talks about this, right? The real key is to be proactive. It's before they enter this state, because remember, we can predict this. Teachers can predict this, parents can predict this. So before that anxiety and fear is present, we're going to address those immediate needs. And those come from observation, not having a judgment or not assuming. Remember, we're not going to assume that they're being manipulative or they're attention seeking or they have some other cause that they want to do. We're able to use our communication skills and we can cooperate, we can partner with that child to figure out, okay, where is all this dysregulation coming from?
Well, and I just want to point out this is the first book that we have in our 2024 book club series. In January, we're taking this book and we're breaking it into 3 sections, and we're covering it in January, February, and March of next year. And so if you're interested in signing up, it's free for anyone to participate. If you'd like to sign up for that, you can do it on our website. But Jen, one of the things I know people talk about in relation to this book is that this sort of collaborative, proactive solution model is really great when the child is stable. But what do you do? How do you apply this when there is a full grown crisis? And it reminds me of something that in November we had a webinar with a paramedic who was talking about how to manage psychiatric emergencies and when to call 911. And one thing that he said is that when you are when you're dealing with a person, child, adolescent, adult, who's having a significant dysregulation, how important it is to stay regulated yourself. Because then when your help arrives, there's still only one patient. If you've become dysregulated as well, then now there's two patients. There's the person who started out with the dysregulation, and then there's you, the caregiver. And so let's jump here to talk about what Dr. Green says about giving them what they need when they're dysregulated.
Yeah, he gives the example of the child who they're screaming they want pizza, but dad made roast chicken and he made vegetables. And they're like, I want the pizza. And they go into this rage. And Dr. Green actually says, give them the pizza. So because that ship has already sailed, Elizabeth, right? They
Yes, it
we
has.
are we are totally way past the point. Like we've missed that opportunity to be proactive. And right now they're stuck in that limbic dysregulation. And remember that idea of kindling, we need to get out of that as quickly as possible. Because if you're talking about a mood disorder, if you're talking about bipolar disorder, the longer they stay in that state, the more intense and the more frequent those further episodes are going to be. So you have got to do everything you can to get that kid out as quickly as possible. And if that means giving them the pizza, you give them that pizza. And that's a really hard concept for people who think, but you're coddling them, you're enabling them. They're just going to do it again the next time. What you're doing is you're building trust in that child, that you're meeting their biological needs, that you're creating safety for them. You're saying, I hear you, I understand you, right? So
And you're
all of
also
those.
saying that you're safe.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people think that it's, as we said, it's enabling, it's all of these other things. It's not weak boundaries.
Nope.
It may look like weak boundaries to people who don't understand, but it is actually excellent parenting and the work of an amazing educator to be able to say, I'm going to meet this child's needs first and foremost, and then we'll get to the next bit.
Right. And so we're going to see that the hippocampus eventually learns to recognize that that adult is trustworthy, that they're safe, and they're going to store those memories. So you're also going to, by doing that, decrease future episodes of dysregulation.
So some of the accommodations that we advocate strongly to parents and that Ross Green talks about in his book, The Explosive Child, are things that, a lot of modern parenting will tisk tisk shake their finger at you for doing. But you know what? They're actually best for using what the limbic system is telling us to help de-escalate and prevent future escalation. Allow the video games and the screen time. Yes, use your blue light filters so that you're not getting overdoses of blue light, but those activities allow them to be distracted from the anxiety, the obsessive fears, the frustrations, the things that they can't control, the involuntary symptoms. It's a reprieve for them, and we all need that. We also talk about letting the child leave the situation. When you were talking earlier about having an exit strategy, giving a child a private place so that they feel safe, that makes it so that they don't feel like they're being watched by people who don't understand, is invaluable in terms of the good that it does for the child. And it really does absolutely no harm at all to give someone a private space to experience their dysregulation rather than making them do it in front of an audience, right? Um,
You
and and maintaining a safe distance, not invading their personal space. You've used this example over and over again with a teacher who's attempting to speak quietly and provide a comforting touch. That's not always going to be what they want.
Yeah, and going back to allowing video games or screen times, parents say, "Oh my gosh, I just can't." But if your child is hypomanic or manic, and that is the only thing that keeps them safe in the moment, they are already dysregulated. So if that's the thing that is going to keep them from walking out of that door and into the middle of the street, that's exactly what you're going to give them at that time, because again, that ship already sailed. So you've got to just try and keep them as safe as you can in that moment.
And when you talk about safety, then we really are talking about safety planning and rehearsing for a crisis. And that uh, this is something as providers we need to be able to do for families.
Yeah, so contrary to popular belief, therapists actually can play a role with families when it comes to the child, when this child is stable. So, when the child is stable, that's the time to do the safety planning, what to do when they become dysregulated. So, it's not uncommon for children or adolescents to be so dysregulated that they're breaking items, they're throwing things, they're knocking over furniture, or even punching holes in the wall. And when those moments occur, it is imperative to the child and all the other persons in that home that they're safe. And this is what the therapist can do, those rehearsals, when we're working with their families. And so the child experiencing dysregulation can sometimes say, I can feel it happening, and they can provide some kind of warning. And this may look like to teachers or extended family or parents that this is planned, that somehow this is deliberate, when in reality, the child is really aware of what's happening internally in their body, and they're really just warning people ahead of time. And so other times, there's really no ability for that dysregulated person in crisis to activate their safety plan. So it becomes necessary for the adults to execute that plan, but you can rehearse that when that child is stable with that family about what that could look like.
Yeah, and let's make note here that ultimatums or repetition of consequences or trying to reason with a child just isn't going to work. As you said, that ship has sailed once they're dysregulated. Once we are in the crisis, telling them that they're going to lose their iPad or their Xbox, or they're not going to be able to go see grandma, it's not going to work. It's going to be perceived as an additional threat to their safety. And when we as professionals work with parents, we have to validate for them that sometimes doing nothing is the best thing you can do. Giving the child the space, um, providing them a place to be safe, and to ride out this limbic system disruption, so that they can get to a place where the body then starts to de escalate on its own. Um, I want to also point out that a lot of families find that when this happens in public, um, they feel very uncomfortable. Sometimes people who are trying to be helpful come up and want to share and help and get involved, or sometimes pass judgment. And one of the things that we have is we offer these wallet cards, where if you are in public and that your child is dysregulated and you're engaging in a way that you know will work to help them, and other people feel like it's time to chime in with their 2 cents, you can just discreetly hand this to them, which says my child has an invisible disability which can cause irritability, anxiety, and difficulties in social interactions. This can result in tantrums such as you're witnessing. And then it directs them somewhere else to learn more, or to get a third party like us to explain it to them, so that those families that are dealing with this can have some peace in public. Now, we talk about recovery and stability as being like a three-legged stool. It requires medication management, it requires therapy, and it requires the lifestyle interventions that we've talked about: diet, exercise, light therapy, cooling strategy, and accommodations. Um, these things work together in order to create an environment for stability. And like a three-legged stool, if one of them is missing, it will fall over. So it is a balancing act, and there's a lot for families to do. And this is where, as clinicians, we can really step in and support families. And I think, Jen, the first thing that we have on this list is something that sometimes we clinicians forget, that it's our job first and foremost to listen.
Yep, absolutely. Parents know when something is wrong, and they keep telling, like, I see this and I see that. And one of the things I'd like to point out is by the time that that parent gets to you and they're saying, I suspect it's bipolar disorder, they've already put in the hours of work. They've been observing their child. They can predict with pretty good accuracy what's going to happen. They've been searching the internet. Um, Not because they're trying to diagnose, but they're looking at what is it that I'm seeing and what is it the most consistent with. And so I know sometimes we joke and we say, like, ooh, Google is where they got their medical degree. That's not it at all. That is not what they're doing. What they're doing is they have read, they've put in the hours of work. So we really need to listen without that judgment and just kind of hear what they're saying and what those symptoms are.
So we're gonna move on to talk now about the questions that are in the Q&A. Um, so, Jen, I'm going to throw the first question out here to you, which is, why don't psychiatrists use brain scans to diagnose? My adopted child has FAS, and I'm not sure his brain is structurally damaged by alcohol and drug use due to pregnancy. During pregnancy, no medication has been able to help his behaviors.
So that's going to depend on what is actually biologically causing the issues. Um, so if it's coming from like a stroke, right, that's going to show up on an MRI. But the problem with using what we call functional MRIs is that it's just a snapshot of that day. And what has happened is that they can take the scan again of the same child in the same kind of situation and it's showing up something completely different. So that's not to say that it doesn't have a role. It's just that it has not been able to give us some fruitful information about what's really happening. So it can in some situations. So as I mentioned, if it's stemming from a stroke or there's some kind of damage that they can see. But when you're talking about things on a cellular level, like a mitochondrial disorder, that's not necessarily going to show up in a brain scan.
Gotcha. Okay. So, someone wrote, a friend has told me I need mitochondrial support, and my son has um, what I call sugar spectrum disorder, um, too much sweets. Um, Jen, can you talk just very briefly about what mitochondrial support might be?
Um, yes. So, you go back to that the three-legged stool approach, right? So the sun is energy. And so we're looking at light therapy, we're looking at diet, because what is food? That's energy. And so what is sleep? It's restorative for energy. So when you're looking at the more of a physiological, biological approach due to a cellular issue or a mitochondrial issue of energy, you're looking at all of the ways that you can best utilize energy throughout the body. And interestingly enough, lithium, which is used to treat mood disorders, is a metal, and it is a really good conductor of energy. So, what it's most likely doing in the brain and body is conducting energy throughout those pathways that it needs to go. It's regulating that. And then what has also been shown, there was a study, and I think it's ongoing, but in mice, it lowers that body temperature for them so that we see that it is also helping to regulate that hypothalamus when we talk about that temperature as well.
So, someone here has asked, there are many symptoms of bipolar that are also present in ADHD. Is ADHD considered a mood disorder? No. ADHD is not considered a mood disorder, but you're right, there are a lot of overlapping symptoms. And because the DSM does not look at cause, it's very easy for bipolar disorder to be mistaken for ADHD in children. In fact, we had a very successful seminar earlier this year, which we're going to encore next year, on differentiating between bipolar disorder and ADHD. Um, but you really do need to know what to look for. And this is one of the ways which our diagnostic consultation program can be very useful for families, because what we do is we go in and we look and we figure out, as part of an extensive differential diagnosis program, a process which most clinicians don't have the time to do because of the requirements of their job. But it's a way to look at symptoms that occur in multiple disorders and be able to look at them and figure out, well, what is most likely causing this symptom, and therefore what diagnosis does it belong with. Someone here also asked to see the slide before the sticker charts. This is that slide. There are a bunch of questions here where people and comments where people are really talking about the idea of how do you know what a child needs? Um, how do you address their need when you aren't seeing any triggers? Um, that it's something they're thinking about, or something that may have happened earlier in the day, or something that they're feeling, or some kind of um, involuntary mood fluctuation as a result of the mood disorder that you can't see. And parents struggle with this, schools struggle with this. Um, and so, how do we know? And I think I want to start by saying in response to one comment about how do we present this to schools is this information is out there. Part of our mission is to get it into the hands of the people who need it. So if you think your school needs it, your school's teachers are required to have trainings. Tell them you want them to be trained, to have a training on one of their professional development days on the limbic system. We're not the only ones. We can go in and do that training. We're not the only ones who can, though. So it's a good opportunity for you to be able to advocate for your child and all the other children in the school as well by saying, let's learn about this. Um, and I think so much of what we're talking about here in reframing, re-understanding what's happening for the child, um, putting the responsibility for changing the tone of the interaction on the adult is really important to reiterate. Because we're not just talking about strategies that are only going to work with children that have mood disorders. These are strategies that we're talking about that can work for everyone. It just so happens that some of the strategies that work for other kids don't work for kids with mood disorders, and this one does. But it doesn't mean it's only for them. It's really for everyone, because what you're doing is you're saying, we understand that what you're struggling with may be biological. We can address that biological undercurrent, and then we can help you get back to being where you need to be. And that's going to be useful for anyone. Jen, did you want to add something to that? I feel like I've been talking a while.
No, I think you covered it really, really nicely.
Um, there's a question here about the ketogenic diet. What about kids who have extremely limited diet, picky eaters, ARFID, um, people who may have a risk of ketoacidosis, diabetes? Um, I'm going to let you handle this one. I will just say our October webinar and clinical seminar were focused on this. We had a family who has used ketogenic therapy to treat bipolar disorder talk about their experience. We had the medical director of Metabolic Mind, who is a cardiologist, come in and talk about the ketogenic diet as a therapy for mental health disorders. Those two are on our YouTube page. So I recommend that if you have questions about this, go watch those two videos. They are on our YouTube page. You can just look us up, Children's Mental Health Resource Center on YouTube, and you'll find those two and you can watch them. But Jen, do you want to talk briefly, because we are over time, but thank you
Yeah,
for
this
sticking
is
with us to hear the answers.
right. So this is an area that we're very passionate about and that we're going to be working in the future more intensely with. But as far as the diabetic ketoacidosis, you're talking about type 1 diabetes. And you're right, this would not be something that they probably it would not be appropriate for them most of the time. And so that you would want to work with your endocrinologist on very closely. And most endocrinologist office have a dietitian and nutritionist part of their treatment plan with their patient. Now, as far as like picky eaters with ARFID and sensory, I don't like to call them picky eaters. I do not like that word at all. I want to throw that out because that quote, that is just saying that they have, this is a behavior by being a picky eater. This is not. There's a sensory sensitivity that is happening somewhere along there. But when you're talking about the ketogenic diet, Um, I suspect, and I don't know this for sure, but I've actually seen this firsthand in a kid who very much has ARFID. And the more they're not completely on a ketogenic diet, but the more that they're heading towards that and making progress to shifting to a less of a westernized diet, the more they're actually willing to try things that they used to be very hesitant, and we're talking about gagging and being afraid of, literally afraid and fearful of those things. And so it's taking time, but I suspect that it actually is going to reduce some of those symptoms that you see in ARFID and some of that sensory sensitivity that we're seeing that limits the amount of foods that we can take in.
So we have a question here about triggers. Going to someone else's home, and then we talked about the ABA in the ABA portion about the fact that sometimes there's no observable trigger. Can we clarify this? And that connects to a comment that someone else made about ABA having its uses with some students and can be used well. Um, but the current understanding and systems of behavior are based on societal acceptance and views and not actual understanding of behaviors. So I think to clarify what we're saying is that um, parents often know what the trigger is going to be. An objective observer may not. And this is one of the drawbacks. And I'm certainly not advocating that we don't use them anymore because they can be extremely helpful. But in a BIP, a behavior intervention plan, that's usually based on a functional behavioral analysis. And what happens is the professional goes in and observes the child and records everything that was going on in the environment prior to a behavior being displayed. Um, Oftentimes there is no identifiable external trigger, but that doesn't mean that a parent or a teacher or a caregiver who is extremely attuned to that child doesn't know what some of those triggers are, and it may not be noticeable to anybody else. It may not, the parent might also know that my kid's going to do fine for an hour, and then at hour, 1 hour and 5 minutes, they're going to start to unravel, and nobody else is going to notice it until 1 hour and 42 minutes. And then they're going to see. So, what we're saying is there isn't always some observable thing, but an attuned parent is going to know, and you can plan for that. It takes a village sometimes, but you can plan for it. And ABA does work in some ways. I guess our point is that you have to know what the struggles are that the child has, what it is. Bipolar disorder, for example, um, social stories, which is an ABA strategy, works really well by giving the child tools to understand what's expected, what's going to happen, what other people are going to do, what they're going to be asked to do in response. It makes them feel safe. It de-escalates anxiety. It can be extremely helpful. Hand over hand, it's going to work horribly. It's going to backfire. As soon as you take a child who's dysregulated and demand that they do it your way and physically force them, that's going to involve a fight or flight response, aggression, territorial and reactive aggressive behaviors and words. And so, as Jen said, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, it's not saying that everything about ABA is, not useful. It's saying they have to be applied strategically. They have to be applied in a way that really takes into consideration what that particular child has the capacity for, not just in general, but in that moment. Is that in that moment, is hand over hand going to trigger a massive escalation in the problem? Or is meeting the child's needs, de escalating them, and then coming back to the task later a better choice? And that's where relationship building comes in and so important, because if you have put in the time to build that relationship, to build that sense of trust, to build that sense of collaboration that Dr. Green talks about, then it's going to be much, much more effective. So yeah, sometimes it's just the child switches from a depressive mood state to a manic mood state, and there's no reason. You're still going to have to cope with the outcomes. But sometimes parents do know, oh, it's 4:30 p.m. My kid is due for a manic episode now. And so if there's a birthday party that starts at 4:45, we're not going. We'll go to the birthday party that starts at 2:30 and ends at 4:30, but we're not going to go to the one that starts at 4:45. And so it's a real balance of, and I guess this comes down to something that Jen, you and I talk about all the time. It's very hard to use any approach that is exclusively formulaic and that does not take into consideration the needs of a given person in a given moment.
I want to say too is that I always, with my default, is I just assume it's biological until I can prove otherwise. And one of those things is sometimes you can't know until you look back. And so I can recall an incident that a parent brought to me where they were outside and their child was having a good time, but then the temperature dropped drastically because there was a storm that moved in. And then that child started to become dysregulated, very anxious, and they shut down. It looked like they were being oppositional at a time that was very inconvenient. And so everyone was thinking that this is behavior related. And in reality, after some time, what we discovered was, well, when did this happen? Ah, there was a storm front that moved in. So in that moment, you're not necessarily going to know, but sometimes if you look back on it, you can actually see what the biological cause was. And in that particular child, they lived with what is called fear of harm. And so we know that temperature regulation for them is a huge issue. And that was what was contributing. It wasn't purposeful, it was biological in nature.
So that's a good example. There are a lot of questions here about how do you know when you should do what a child demands or not? We heard meet the need, give them the pizza, but we also heard that the processed diet is problematic and contributes. Is the pizza in that example really a need or a want? Won't the child learn that dysregulation gets them video games and then the next time they'll manipulate? Um, you know, there are a lot of these questions. One thing I will say is that this is part of what our palliative parenting class is designed to teach: how to understand, how to interpret, how to know when and why and how to implement these kinds of collaborative solutions, this meeting of the need that is being presented by the limbic system. And I know how hard it is to look at a kid who's having a tantrum because they're not having pizza and think to yourself, this isn't a need, this is a want. This kid is manipulating. This kid is bullying me into giving them what they want. And when they get it, they're going to be smug. And the next time, they're not going to be willing to try the chicken. And I don't know how to explain how very much that is not the case, because what's happening when the kid is saying, but I wanted pizza, I thought I was having pizza, what they're doing is they're telling you, I was unprepared for this. I don't feel safe. I don't know how to pivot. I don't know how to make this change that you're asking me to make. I may want to, but I don't know how to. And now my limbic system has taken over and I can't control any of this. And that is communicating, I need help. And when the limbic system is out of control, giving the child what they want is no different than giving a child who's having an asthma attack their inhaler, or a child whose blood sugar has gotten dangerously low, their medication. It is not a choice. Kids want to be accepted, they want to be loved, they want to be appreciated, they want to belong and be a part of the group. And when these behaviors happen, they feel ostracized, they feel humiliated, they feel as though they are being judged and misunderstood. They don't want to behave this way. But I've seen kids who have been able to look at their teacher and say, can't handle this right now. I need 15 minutes on my device so that I can regulate. Then they go and they sit in another part of the classroom and do 15 minutes of their preferred activity on their device. And when it times out, they give it back to the teacher and they sit down and they do the work, because it's not a reward, it's a coping skill. And nobody abuses their coping skill to manipulate other people. They use their coping skills so that they can develop the capacity to meet the expectations that other people have of them. So, no, I would say the child will not learn that getting their video games or the pizza when they're dysregulated teaches them how to manipulate others. I think what it teaches them is that they're safe, they have someone with them who understands, and next time they can ask for what they need before the dysregulation occurs.
And I think
Go
it's
ahead.
important to remember to go back to that definition of what is a disorder, right? So if you truly are living with a mood disorder or you're living with bipolar disorder, these are things that you're going to see over and over again. These aren't like sometime issues. These are issues that you're seeing across the board, that is really truly interfering with their ability to function. They cannot function in school, they cannot function at home, they cannot function socially. And so, if you are seeing a breakdown in their ability to function, then you want to figure out, okay, what are the root causes from this? And what we're seeing in psychiatric illnesses, is that there are physiological and biological root causes for this.
Yes. And I'm seeing questions here that are talking about issues related to supporting teachers. How do we do this in the classroom? How do we address the needs of the one student when there are 22 or 27 kids in the classroom all at the same time? Um, these these approaches that we're advocating for occur in every age group and can be used by anyone who is responsible for children. We call it palliative parenting, but that doesn't mean that it can only be used as a strategy by parents. It can be used by teachers. It can be used by therapists. It can be used in any context because it's fundamentally about understanding the child, their needs, and providing them with the opportunity for the best quality of life. So, what I would say is if you want to learn more about this, if you want to dig into how to use these strategies instead of disciplinary ones, if you're a teacher, tell the person who schedules your professional development workshops that you want to learn about this. Give them the email address admin@cmhrc.org and we will set up a training. If you're a parent, sign up for our palliative parenting course. We received a grant from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and that is being used to subsidize the cost. Right now, for a certain number of participants, we are going to be able to have the price for the fee for participation drop from $399 to $80, which is an unbelievable savings considering it's an 8-week course with 8 90-minute sessions. So anyone interested in that, email admin@cmhrc.org and say I want to learn about signing up for the palliative parenting class that starts in January. We are very over on our time. Thank you to those of you who have stuck with us. I want to just mention that some of the other questions that we have here, I can answer sort of quickly by saying, if you want a certificate of attendance, please email learning, LEARNING, @cmhrc.org, and we will get you a certificate of attendance. Please specify whether or not you are a professional of some kind or whether you are a family member. We have different certificates depending upon what your needs are. So please let us know if you're a professional or a family member. Folks are asking about how do I know when it's a need or a want? Sign up for our palliative parenting class. Spots are limited, so you're going to want to do that sooner rather than later. how do I know if my child has a mood disorder or ADHD or both? Or is it anxiety? Is it depression? Is it bipolar? Go to our website and read about our diagnostic consultation program. You can schedule a free consultation with one of us directly through our website. You don't have to call anybody. You can do it at 2 in the morning if that's when you're free. You sign up for that. I mean, you can sign up at 2 in the morning. You can't have an appointment at 2 in the morning, but you know what I meant. And we will meet with you for free and see whether or not that's a service that you can benefit from. um, People want to know how to get copies of this presentation. That is something that you can do by being a member of CMHRC. And so sign up. We're running a holiday discount. Using the discount code Merry, MERRY, will get you a 50% discount on the first year of a new membership. You will have access to our complete webinar archive, clinical seminar archive, all of our educational videos, support groups, professional development groups. There's really a tremendous amount, free access to the toolkit, which is just a huge value in and of itself. And so all of these things you can get by joining our community and doing more than just coming to our monthly webinars and clinical seminars, but really joining us in this work to improve quality of life and ensure that children and families get the guidance and resources that they need as early as possible to guarantee long-term positive outcomes through adolescence and in adulthood. We have a webinar, or excuse me, a clinical seminar coming up in January on the 24th. It is called Helping the Helpers, Self-Care for Mental Health Providers. We know as well as anyone, as mental health providers ourselves, we put other people first. We don't take time for ourselves. And in this webinar, we're going to specifically be talking about how we as providers can take care of ourselves so that we can be better at what we do in the year to come. So you can sign up for that on our website on the clinical seminars page. We also have a community briefing webinar in January to tell everybody about all the new exciting things that we're going to be doing. There was one question here from a dietitian. I would encourage you, Grace, to reach out to us directly, admin@cmhrc.org, if you have questions about the ketogenic diet, because we will be able to put you in touch with the people who are spearheading this. They're not at our organization. You can check them out at metabolicmind.org and get more information. Obviously, it's not necessarily going to be right for everyone. We're not advocating for that. One thing that we do advocate, though, is that any move towards a healthier lifestyle does improve mental health outcomes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that for today. Again, if you didn't get your questions answered, please email admin@cmhrc and you will be directed to the person that you need to speak with. Thank you so much for being here. Have a happy holiday. And as the year ends, please consider making a gift to CMHRC to support all of the work we do with families and providers. Have a great rest of your evening. We'll see you in January. Bye.